Cut an 8-inch piece from a 2x4 for both the magazine well and magazine well handle. Cut 1 1/4 away from the 8-inch piece. Save this piece for the magazine well handle. To get the width of the magazine well, use a square and measure the distance between the rails and the edge of the base. Translate the measurement onto the magazine well. It should be about 1.89 inches. Cut the magazine well to its final width of 1.89 inches. Position the magazine well on its side and measure 2.53 inches roughly in the middle. This is for the dado cuts we will do later. Turn the magazine well 90 degrees and measure 0.882 from the bottom edge. This will be the height of our dado cuts. To make the measurements for the magazine catch, we first need to translate the 2.53 measurement to the top. Use a square and translate the measurement to the top as demonstrated. Make the first mark for the magazine catch. Measure 0.765 inches from the right line. Then measure 1.238 inches from the front edge of the magazine well. This will give us the center for the hole to be drilled for the magazine catch. Center punch the measurement for the magazine catch. You can use a screw to do this. Set the blade height on the table saw to 0.882 inches to prepare for the dado cuts. Using the first line we marked at 2.53 inches, begin making the dado cuts. Then make a series of cuts until you have removed all 2.53 inches of material. Using a 1/4 inch drill bit, drill a hole where we marked for the magazine catch earlier. To machine the magazine catch, you're going to need a 1/4 inch by 3/4 inch bolt and 2 1/4 inch nuts. In preparation to grind the magazine catch, we need to clamp the 2 nuts attached to the bolt. This will give us something to grip as we begin shaping the magazine catch from the bolt head. This animation demonstrates the process for grinding the bolt head. You want to grind the 2 edges of the bolt until they are flush with the thread. Then grind the other 2 edges until they fit the hole in the magazine. Grind the bolt head on both sides until it sits flush to the thread. Grind the other 2 edges and test fit the magazine hole and make any adjustments necessary. Grind the top of the magazine catch bolt head until it's 1/8 of an inch thick. Use a file and chamfer the top edges of the magazine catch. Remove the 2 nuts from the magazine catch. The magazine catch should look similar to this when you're done. Remove a 1/4 of an inch from the magazine catch thread. You can use a vise clamp and a hacksaw to do this. Temporarily assemble the magazine catch to the magazine well. Insert the magazine catch into the hole, then slide a washer over the top and tighten it down with a 1/4 inch nut. To secure the magazine catch in place, use a file to hold it in place while tightening down the nut with a 7/16 inch wrench. Now test to make sure the magazine fits correctly into the magazine well. To align the magazine well with the channel, place 2 rounds in the magazine and mount the magazine in the magazine well. Then place 1 single round between the 2 rails. Move the magazine well until the round in the magazine is aligned with the round between the rails. Now the magazine well is correctly aligned with the channel. While still holding it in place, mark both sides where the magazine well intersects the base. Now we will cut away the 2 areas we just marked. Cut the magazine well to its final width from the area we marked earlier. Disassemble the magazine catch from the magazine well. Now tape the magazine well top template to the top of the magazine well. Now center punch all 6 marked areas. Pre-drill all 6 marked areas with a 3/32 drill bit. Use a 1/2 inch countersink bit. Countersink the 4 holes indicated at the top right corner of your screen. Align the magazine well and clamp it in place. Pre-drill the 2 inside holes with a 3/32 drill bit. This will mark the areas on the base where we need to drill the holes for the metal dowels. Set the drill depth to 1/2 inch and drill both holes we marked earlier with a 5/16 drill bit. Set the drill press depth to 1.25 and drill the 2 remaining holes with a 21/64 drill bit. Using a square, measure the magazine well. Then translate the measurement onto the magazine well handle. This will give us the length of our handle. Extend the line across to mark the end of the handle. Measure 1/2 inch from the bottom edge of both sides of the handle and make a mark. Set your protractor to 60 degrees and extend a line from the 1/2 inch mark on both sides of the handle. Measure 1.25 inches from both ends of the handle and make a mark. Measure a 1/2 inch for the dado cut. Cut the magazine well handle to the final length from the area we marked earlier. Start the dado cuts from the inside edge where we marked 1.25 inches. Continue cutting until you've removed all material between the 2 measurements. Using a belt sander, sand the 60-degree bevel we measured earlier. Do this for both sides. For this next step, we'll be using an 1.25 inch round over bit to round over the leading edges of both the magazine well and handle. To remember what edges are going to be rounded over, you can mark them with an arrow. Do this for both the magazine well and handle. Carefully cut the leading edge on both sides of the magazine well with 1 1/4 inch round over bit. Then cut both leading edges on the handle. Be very careful when cutting the beveled edge. Using some 220 grit sandpaper, lightly sand both the magazine well and handle. They should look like this after sanding. Reassemble the magazine catch to the magazine well. Mark the middle of both edges of the magazine well on the top. This is so we can align the handle later on. Mark the middle on both edges of the handle. Fasten some number 8 2-inch screws in place to act as a marker for the handle. Leave about 1/16 of an inch of the screw exposed on all 4 screws. Align the handle with the center lines we drew earlier and press it in place. This will mark where we need to pre-drill the holes for the screws. Pre-drill the marked holes with a 3/32 drill bit. Be careful not to drill all the way through. Place the handle back on top and drive the screws in all the way. To glue the metal dowels in place, you need a paper towel, a stir stick, a mixing area for the epoxy itself, and 2 metal dowels. Squeeze a small amount of epoxy into the mixing area. Mix the epoxy together until it turns a white color, then you know it's ready. Apply a small amount of epoxy into both holes. Apply a small amount of epoxy to the metal dowel and press it in place. Follow the same process for the other metal dowel. Use a paper towel to clean up any squeeze out from the epoxy. Before the dowels set in the epoxy, press the magazine well in place. This is to make sure the dowels track properly with the magazine well. Do this a few times, then leave the magazine well in place and let the dowels dry overnight. Using the plunger handle template, mark the 1x2 to be cut. Using the plunger spacer template, mark the 1x2 to be cut. Next, use a small piece of 1/4 inch oak plywood and mark 2.25 inches for the length and 2.25 inches for the width. This will be for the plunger base plate. Now move over to the table saw and cut the plunger handle, spacer, and bed plate to their final dimensions. Using some 150 grit sandpaper, sand all the faces and edges for both the plunger handle and spacer until they are square. Now we need to mark the holes to be drilled in the plunger base plate. Measure 3/4 of an inch on both sides and make a mark. Rotate the plunger base plate 90 degrees and measure 1 1/8 inches and make a mark. This will give us the center point for both holes. To mark the radius on the corners of the plunger base plate, use a 1/4 inch washer. Do this for all 4 corners. Next, we need to create some center lines to use for later when we align the plunger spacer on top of the base plate. Measure in 1 1/8 inches and leave a mark on all 4 edges as shown here. Turn the plunger spacer on its side and mark the center on both the top and bottom. Do this for all 4 sides. Extend a line across the bottom of the plunger handle and mark the center. Do this for both sides. Then rotate the handle on its side and translate the center line on all 4 sides. Center punch the 2 marked holes on the plunger base plate. Now drill the 2 marked holes with a 3/32 drill bit. Turn the plunger base plate over and countersink the 2 holes with a 1/2 inch countersink bit. Align the plunger spacer and base plate together using the center lines we marked earlier. Then rotate it over and mark the 2 holes on the spacer as shown. Now drill the 2 holes we marked on the plunger spacer with a 3/32 drill bit. Using a belt sander with 150 grit sandpaper, round over all 4 corners as shown. Remove the pencil marks from the plunger base plate with an eraser and 220 grit sandpaper. Flip the plunger handle over and mark the areas that are going to be cut with a round over bit. Use a 1/4 inch round over bit to round over the edges. Now round over the edges on the top. Be very careful and keep your fingers away from the blade. To round over the edges on the side, flip the handle on its side. Remove any rough edges or burn marks left over from the router with some 220 grit sandpaper. To assemble the plunger, place the spacer on top of the base, then fasten it in place with 2 No. 8 1¼ inch wood screws. Make sure the screws are holding the spacer in place but haven't gone all the way through. Now place the plunger handle on top of the spacer and align it with the marks we made earlier. Then holding it firmly, drive the screws in the rest of the way. With the plunger handle fully assembled, let's test the magazine loader. Remove the magazine well and slide the plunger into place. Then mount the magazine to the magazine well, place 30 rounds between the rails, and give it a test run. Now it's time to clean up the rough edges left behind from the router. Using a belt sander with 150 grit, sand all 4 edges of the magazine loader. Finish sanding the top and inside edges by hand with 220 grit sandpaper. Do not use a palm sander, you will sand straight through the veneer. As you will see, I made that mistake. Cut some 320 and 600 grit sandpaper the same width as the plunger base plate. Apply some double stick tape to the back side of the 320 and 600 grit sandpaper. Starting with 320 grit sandpaper, begin sanding the bed plate, then move on to 600 and repeat the process. As we did with the bed plate, sand the bottom of the plunger with 320 and 600 grit sandpaper. Remove any dust collected on the bed plate with a cloth. Using some candle wax, apply a liberal amount to the bed plate, then wipe away with a cloth. Repeat the same process to the bottom of the plunger. When you are finished, the plunger should glide easily between the rails. To make it easier to place rounds onto the magazine loader, we will create hash marks in increments of 5 all the way up to 30. To transfer the template ammunition markings onto the rail, apply Elmer's glue to the top rail using your finger. This is so the ink does not bleed into the wood. To speed up the drying process, you can use a heat gun or a blow dryer at a low setting. Mount the magazine in place, then place 5 rounds between the channel, and make a hash mark on the upper rail for 5. Repeat the same process until you've reached 30 rounds. The upper rail should look something like this when you've finished. Cut out the ammunition markings template as shown here. Then use a pencil and on the back side scribble everywhere a number appears. To transfer the number onto the rail, position it in place and write over the top of the number with a sharp pencil. To permanently place the number on the rail, use a fine-tip Sharpie pen. Repeat the last 2 steps to finish the other ammunition markings. When you're finished, the upper rail should look like this. Using blue painter's tape, mask the bed plate and plunger base plate. Then apply 2 to 3 coats of polyurethane to all the surfaces of the magazine loader. Apply a thin coat of polyurethane to the surfaces of the magazine loader. Please note how the bed plate was taped off before painting. To easily paint the magazine well, you can create a painting jig with 2 screws in it that align with the holes on the magazine well, as shown below. Mask the plunger base plate with blue tape, as shown here, before applying the polyurethane. Congratulations, you've completed the build of the magazine loader. If you were not successful, please don't be discouraged. Please send your questions to info@diymagazineloader.com and we will be happy to answer any questions you have. If you enjoyed building this project, please like us on Facebook and share your work. Thanks again for choosing diymagazineloader.com.